Welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving deep today into a single source, and it's a
this is a good one.
Yeah, it's a real page turner. It's a Brazilian federal police report, and well, it reads like a political thriller. Honestly,
It does.
it dives into an alleged plot to overturn the 2022 election in Brazil.
Yeah.
And we've got the report right here. Relatorio final PF site 2024 1 compressed -golpe2.pdf. That's the file name.
Catchy.
Yeah, so we're ready to unpack it.
Yeah, but this is not just like some, disgruntled voters or anything. The report alleges a coordinated effort involving high-ranking officials, military figures, even social media influencers.
So, okay, let's set the stage quickly for our listeners.
Yeah.
2022 Brazil's presidential election.
Nail biter.
Total nail biter. Bolsonaro loses to Lula.
Right.
But his supporters cry foul, claiming fraud. And this police report, it was supposed to investigate those claims, but what it uncovered...
One bigger.
Way bigger.
Yeah, it lays out a potential plot to keep Bolsonaro in power. It goes way beyond just contesting the election results.
Right.
Like they had plans to seize control.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that really jumped out at you from this report?
Honestly, a few things that really stand out to me. First, the alleged involvement of the military.
Oh, wow.
Active and retired military officers in this scheme. We're not talking about fringe figures here.
Right.
These are people with real power and influence.
That's disturbing.
Yeah.
On multiple levels.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got military involvement. What else?
Well, the report details plans to not only surveil but potentially harm Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes,
Oh, wow.
who was a frequent target of Bolsonaro and his supporters.
Right.
And they were gathering information on his family, his movements, everything.
It's like something straight out of a spy novel,
It is
except the stakes are
way higher.
incredibly real.
Yeah,
We're talking about undermining the highest court in the land.
that's right.
And it doesn't stop there. There's evidence of a concerted effort to manipulate the military into action.
Okay.
They appealed to patriotism, the stolen election narratives, and even drafted a decree to declare a state of emergency.
Wow.
All tactics to potentially keep Bolsonaro in power illegally.
It's like they were trying to create a justification for a coup, using the language of national security and patriotism to mask their true intentions.
Exactly. And we can't forget the role of social media influencers.
Right.
The report alleges they were used to spread misinformation, whip up public anger, and mobilize support for this plot.
So this isn't just online chatter. There is about using digital platforms to manipulate public opinion and influence real-world events.
Real-world events with huge consequences.
Okay, so we've got potential abuse of power, alleged threats of violence, and a whole lot of digital manipulation. This is shaping up to be a wild ride.
It is.
Let's start by introducing our listener to the key players in this saga.
Okay.
At the center of it all is
Jair Bolsonaro, the president at the time. The report alleges that he was not just aware of, but actively directing this plot to retain power.
That's right.
And it's not just Bolsonaro, though.
No.
This report names a whole cast of characters.
It does.
Who else should our listener keep in mind?
Well, one name that pops up constantly is Mauro Cid Bolsonaro's aide.
Oh, okay.
He's painted as a central figure communicating with various players and allegedly gathering that intel on Justice Moraes.
So he's like the alleged orchestrator, the one connecting all the dots.
That's the picture the report paints.
Okay.
And then, of course, we have Justice Moraes himself, the alleged target of the surveillance and potential harm.
Right, and he was a major thorn in the side of the Bolsonaro administration, consistently ruling against them on key issues.
He was.
So he's not just a victim in this story.
No.
He's also a symbol of the very institutions they were allegedly trying to undermine.
Absolutely. Then we have all these military officers.
Right.
Active and retired that are named in the report. Some are accused of planning, others of encouraging action against the election results.
Right.
All using their positions of authority to potentially influence events.
It's like they were trying to use the legitimacy and respect that the military holds in Brazil to lend credibility to their claims.
Exactly.
And we can't forget about the social media influencers,
Oh, no.
who the report alleges played a key role in amplifying the message of a stolen election
Right.
and mobilizing support for the alleged plot.
Yeah.
They used their platforms to spread misinformation and create a climate of fear and distrust.
It's a familiar playbook.
So we've got the alleged mastermind, his alleged right-hand man, a target who represents the rule of law, military figures allegedly lending their clout,
Yeah.
and a whole network of digital amplifiers.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But this complex web is what makes the report so fascinating.
Right.
And it's important for our listener to understand the interplay of all these different players.
If they want to grasp the full scope of what allegedly happened.
Absolutely.
Now, how about we dive into the timeline and the strategies allegedly employed in this plot?
Yeah.
It wasn't just one big event.
No.
This was a series of actions, right?
Right. It seems like there were different phases to the alleged plan.
Okay.
Each with its own set of tactics. First, there was the effort to discredit the election itself.
Oh, interesting.
Even before a single vote was cast.
So they were already setting the stage for potential conflict.
Yes.
Preemptively sowing seeds of doubt.
Exactly.
How did they go about that?
Well, they spread doubts about the voting machines.
Okay.
Claiming they were vulnerable to manipulation. They even fabricated evidence to support their claims.
Wow.
The report highlights specific examples where experts involved admitted that the evidence was faked.
So they were knowingly pushing a false information.
They were.
That level of premeditation is chilling.
And it didn't stop there. They also allegedly pressured military leaders to intervene.
Okay.
Using that stolen election narrative and playing on patriotic sentiments.
Right. Imagine the weight of those arguments coming from high-ranking officials, people you're supposed to trust.
It's a classic tactic, exploiting existing anxieties and loyalties for your own gain.
It is?
But were they just relying on pressure and propaganda?
Well,
or was there any attempt to use legal means to achieve their goals?
There was. The report details attempts to exploit legal loopholes.
Okay.
Like that draft decree we mentioned.
Right.
That aimed to declare a state of emergency. Which could have granted Bolsonaro sweeping powers, potentially allowing him to remain in office indefinitely.
So they were trying to create a legal facade.
Yes.
For what was essentially a power grab.
Exactly.
And the report mentions specific legal articles that they were trying to twist to their advantage?
Yes. And alongside these legal maneuvers, there was a relentless information war being waged online.
Of course.
Social media was used to spread misinformation, attack opponents, and rally supporters to action.
It's a classic playbook.
It is, but the speed and reach of social media make it even more potent.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a virus spreading distrust and division at an alarming rate.
Exactly. The report is full of specific examples that show just how effective this tactic was.
Okay.
They created hashtags, spread memes, and even used bots and trolls to amplify their message and silence their critics.
It's chilling to see how easily these tools can be weaponized for political gain.
It is.
It's like they were trying to create an alternate reality where their version of the truth was the only one that mattered.
That's a great way to put it. They were trying to control the narrative to shape public perception.
Right.
And ultimately to influence the outcome of the election.
So we've got the players, we've got the strategies, and we've got a sense of just how high the stakes were.
Yeah.
But what about the evidence? What did the police actually uncover that supports these allegations?
That's where things get really interesting. This report isn't just based on conjecture or hearsay.
Okay.
It's packed with hard evidence stuff that makes the whole thing feel like a spy thriller.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat.
Good.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for starters, there are tons of WhatsApp messages between key players.
Ooh, juicy.
They reveal their intentions, their coordination, even their awareness of the illegal nature of their actions.
Oh, does the report actually quote any of these messages?
It does.
Give our listener a taste of what was being said behind closed doors.
There are actual quotes that reveal their mindset and plans. For example, one message from a military figure reads,
Hold on. Let's save those quotes for a bit later when we can really dive into the nitty-gritty details. I don't want to spoil all the fun just yet.
Fair enough. But trust me, those messages are explosive. They provide a first-hand account of what was being discussed and planned at the highest levels of power.
Okay, fine. You win. But besides the WhatsApp messages, what other smoking guns did they find? What else makes this report so compelling?
Well, remember that Punhal Verde Amarillo or Yellow-Green Dagger plan we mentioned?
Yeah.
The report includes this document, outlining a potential military operation complete with weapons lists.
Wait, a literal plan for military action?
Yeah.
This is getting really serious.
It is. And then there's the alleged surveillance of Justice Moraes. We're talking photos taken near his home.
Gosh.
Indicating they were watching his every move.
It's a chilling thought. This wasn't just talk. They were taking concrete steps to potentially silence and intimidate a Supreme Court justice. It makes you wonder, how far were they willing to go?
Exactly. And then there's the draft decree itself.
Right.
It outlines a plan to seize control of the electoral process.
Wow.
granting Bolsonaro powers that could have essentially made him a dictator.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a fringe idea.
Right.
It was a document circulating among high-ranking officials.
That's a sobering thought, isn't it? The fact that something like this could even be contemplated, let alone allegedly planned, it really speaks volumes about the fragility of democracy.
Absolutely. And that brings us to an important point. While this report presents compelling evidence, it's crucial to acknowledge that there are other perspectives. Bolsonaro and his supporters have vehemently denied any wrongdoing, claiming the report is politically motivated.
So they're essentially saying this is a hit job, a way to discredit them and silence their movement.
Precisely. And legal experts and political analysts have offered a range of opinions,
Right.
with some seeing clear evidence of a criminal conspiracy, while others are more cautious in their interpretation.
This is where it gets tricky, right? We're dealing with a complex situation with multiple players and computing narratives.
Yeah,
How can our listener make sense of all this?
that's where critical thinking comes in.
Yeah.
It's crucial to consider all perspectives, weigh the evidence, and be aware of potential biases.
Right.
And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. We encourage our listener to explore the sources we've mentioned and form their own conclusions.
Exactly. Don't just take our word for it, or the reports for that matter.
Yeah.
Do your own research, dig deeper, and engage with the information critically.
Now, speaking of digging deeper, let's zoom in on a particularly unsettling detail from the report.
Right.
The alleged secret meeting convened by Bolsonaro with top government officials.
Okay, this sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
What was so secret about this meeting? What went down?
It allegedly took place on July 22nd, 2022,
Okay.
months before the election even took place.
Right.
The report suggests Bolsonaro used this gathering to try and pressure those present into supporting his narrative of a rigged election.
So he was already laying the groundwork for challenging the results even before a single vote was cast.
That's what the report indicates. And to add weight to his claims, he brought in high-ranking military officials.
So he was using the authority of the military to bolster his claims and potentially intimidate those who disagreed with him.
Yeah.
That's a blatant attempt to blur the lines between civilian government and the armed forces.
And it seems this meeting wasn't just about talk. Following this gathering, key members of Bolsonaro's inner circle started actively seeking ways to challenge the election results, even consulting with foreign experts known for spreading election misinformation.
So they were shopping around for validation, seeking out anyone who would legitimize their claims, no matter how dubious.
That's the impression you get from the report.
Yeah.
And remember, Mauro Cid Bolsonaro's aide?
Yeah.
The report shows that in November 2022, just weeks after the election, he received documents from an army colonel alleging irregularities in the voting process.
So they were trying to build a case-gathering ammunition for their attacks on the electoral system. But was this evidence legitimate?
That's where it gets interesting. The report reveals that some of these documents were based on fabricated data.
Okay.
And Cid was allegedly aware of this.
So they were knowingly spreading lies, trying to deceive the public with false information. This is a serious allegation.
It is. And it points to a coordinated effort to manipulate the narrative and undermine the election.
This reminds me of something else we touched upon earlier, the Ministry of Defense report.
Right.
That was supposed to assess the integrity of the electoral system. What happened with that?
Well, the report indicates this Ministry of Defense report was ultimately suppressed because it failed to find evidence of widespread irregularities. It seems they were hoping for a smoking gun,
Yeah.
but when they didn't find it, they decided to bury the whole thing.
That's pretty damning. It suggests they were more interested in protecting their own narrative than uncovering the truth.
Exactly. And this attempt to control the flow of information raises serious concerns about transparency and accountability.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the alleged targeting of Justice Moraes.
Okay.
The report goes into quite a bit of detail about the surveillance and potential threats against him.
Yes, and it's particularly disturbing. They weren't just monitoring his public statements.
Right.
The report reveals that they were gathering information on his personal life, his family, his movements, anything they could use to intimidate or discredit him.
It's a chilling reminder that when those in power feel threatened, they often resort to desperate measures. They'll attack anyone who stands in their way, even if it means undermining the very institutions that are supposed to protect us all.
And the report suggests this wasn't just about gathering information. There was a real fear that they might try to physically harm Moraes. Remember that incident on December 15th, 2022, where individuals associated with the plot were spotted near his residence?
Right. They were using burner phones and code names like they were on some kind of clandestine mission. It sounds straight out of a spy novel.
And it highlights the very real danger that Moraes was in. He wasn't just a political opponent.
Right.
He was a target.
Now let's circle back to that draft decree we keep mentioning.
Okay.
It seems to be a central piece of this alleged plot, a blueprint for seizing control.
It is. And it's worth taking a closer look at what it actually proposed. Essentially, it aimed to give Bolsonaro sweeping powers to control the government and neutralize any opposition. We're talking about suspending the Constitution, restricting freedom of speech, and even arresting political opponents.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel, a step-by-step guide to dismantling democracy. And the fact that this document was circulating among Bolsonaro's inner circle is incredibly disturbing.
It is. It suggests that this wasn't just an abstract idea. It was a plan they were seriously considering. And it raises a lot of questions about how close Brazil came to a full-blown authoritarian takeover.
This whole story is like a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile democracy can be, even in a country like Brazil, with a relatively long history of democratic governance.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of a vigilant citizenry, a free press, and a strong judiciary, all of which are essential to safeguarding democracy.
Now, we've talked a lot about the alleged plot itself, but what about the broader context? How did the social and political climate in Brazil contribute to this situation? Was there something unique about this moment in Brazilian history that made this sort of thing possible?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that this alleged plot didn't occur in a vacuum.
Right.
It was a product of a specific set of circumstances, a confluence of factors that created a fertile ground for this kind of extremism to take root.
So what were some of those factors? What was it about Brazil at that time that made it so vulnerable?
Well, for starters, Brazil was and still is a deeply divided country, both politically and socially. Bolsonaro's rise to power was fueled by this division.
Right.
By tapping into people's fears and anxieties about crime, corruption, and economic inequality.
So he was a master of exploiting existing grievances, of turning people against each other and creating a climate of fear and distrust.
Exactly. And he was incredibly effective at using social media to do this.
Of course.
He created a powerful online echo chamber.
Right.
Where his supporters could reinforce each other's beliefs and demonize their opponents.
It's a tactic we've seen used by populist leaders all over the world. They bypass traditional media and create their own channels of communication where they can control the narrative and spread their message directly to their followers.
And it's incredibly powerful because when people are constantly bombarded with the same message, especially if it confirms their existing biases and fears, it's easy for them to start believing it, even if it's not true.
So we've got deep societal divisions, a charismatic leader who's willing to exploit those divisions for his own gain, and a powerful new tool, social media, that allows him to bypass traditional gatekeepers and spread his message directly to the masses. It's a recipe for disaster.
It is. And it's a reminder that democracy is a fragile thing, and it requires constant vigilance and protection. We can't take it for granted. We have to be willing to fight for it, to speak out against injustice, and to hold our leaders accountable.
Now, let's bring this back to the report itself.
Okay.
It's clear that it paints a damning picture of Bolsonaro and his allies. But does it offer any solutions? Does it suggest any ways to prevent this kind of thing from happening again?
It does. The report highlights several areas where reforms are needed to strengthen democratic institutions and safeguard against future attempts to subvert the electoral process.
So it's not just about exposing wrongdoing.
No.
It's about learning from the past and taking steps to prevent it from repeating itself.
Exactly. One of the key recommendations is to strengthen the independence of the judiciary and the electoral system.
Okay. This means ensuring that judges and election officials are free from political pressure and that they have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively.
So basically making sure that the institutions that are supposed to uphold democracy are actually able to do so.
Yes.
Without fear of reprisal or interference.
Precisely. The report also calls for greater transparency and accountability in government.
Okay.
This means making sure that government officials are held responsible for their actions, that corruption is punished, and that the public has access to information about how their government is operating.
It's about restoring trust in government, which has been eroded by years of corruption and scandal. Without trust, it's hard to build a strong and stable democracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, the report emphasizes the need to combat disinformation and promote media literacy.
Right.
This means educating people about how to identify and evaluate information. And it means holding social media companies accountable for the spread of harmful content on their platforms.
So it's about empowering citizens to be critical thinkers.
Yeah, to be able to discern fact from fiction and to resist manipulation.
Exactly. Because in the age of social media, information is power. And if we don't know how to use that power wisely, we're all vulnerable to being manipulated.
This report really lays bare the challenges that democracies are facing in the 21st century. It's not just about protecting against traditional threats like military coups. It's about safeguarding against new and emerging threats like disinformation, political polarization, and the erosion of trust.
It is. And it's a reminder that democracy is not something that we can take for granted. It's something that we have to constantly work to protect and strengthen.
Now, I know this has been a lot to process.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the specific details of the alleged plot to the broader implications for democracy in Brazil and beyond.
It's a complex and multifaceted story, and there's still a lot that we don't know. But the report provides a valuable starting point for understanding what happened and what we can do to prevent something like this from happening again.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you want our listener to remember? What's the big picture here?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that democracy is under threat, not just in Brazil, but all over the world.
Right.
And those threats are often subtle and insidious. They don't always come in the form of tanks rolling down the street.
They come in the form of disinformation campaigns, efforts to undermine trust in institutions, and attempts to erode democratic norms and values.
Exactly. And we need to be aware of these threats, and we need to be willing to fight back against them.
Another key takeaway is that social media has become a powerful tool for both good and evil.
Yeah.
It can be used to spread democracy and human rights, but it could also be used to undermine them.
It's a double-edged sword.
And we need to be thoughtful about how we use social media. And we need to demand that social media companies take more responsibility for the content that is shared on their platforms. Finally, I think the most important takeaway of all is that we, the people, have the power to protect democracy. We can't sit back and expect someone else to do it for us.
We need to be informed, engaged, and willing to speak out against injustice.
We need to hold our leaders accountable.
Yes.
And we need to demand better from them.
And we need to work together to create a more just and equitable society where everyone has a voice and everyone's rights are respected.
Because in the end, democracy is about more than just elections.
It is.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and freedom.
Now, before we wrap up completely, let's address the elephant in the room.
Okay.
While the report focuses on Brazil, are there any lessons here for other countries? Could similar tactics be used to undermine democracy elsewhere?
That's the unsettling question, isn't it? Could what allegedly happened in Brazil be a blueprint for undermining democracy elsewhere?
It's a possibility we can't ignore. The tactics outlined in the report, disinformation, exploiting legal loopholes, manipulating the military, these aren't unique to Brazil. We've seen echoes of these strategies in other countries, even those with long-standing democratic traditions.
So what does that mean for the rest of us? Are there any safeguards in place to prevent something like this from happening closer to home?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. Every country has its own unique set of vulnerabilities, its own political and social dynamics.
Of course.
But there are some universal principles that are essential for safeguarding democracy.
Okay, like what? What are some of the things that we should be looking out for?
Well, first and foremost, a strong and independent judiciary is crucial.
Okay.
Judges need to be able to make decisions based on the law, not on political pressure or personal gain.
So basically, we need a system where the courts can act as a check on the power of the executive branch.
Exactly.
Ensuring that everyone is held accountable to the same set of rules.
That's right. And equally important is a free and independent press. Journalists need to be able to report on what's happening without fear of censorship or reprisal. They act as watchdogs, holding those in power accountable and informing the public about what's going on.
It's about having multiple sources of information.
Yes.
So that people can get a balanced perspective.
Right.
And make informed decisions.
Absolutely. And then there's civic engagement.
Okay.
A healthy democracy requires active participation from its citizens. People need to be informed about the issues they need to vote, and they need to hold their elected officials accountable.
So it's not enough to just sit back and complain about the government.
No.
We need to be active participants in the process.
Yes.
Making our voices heard and demanding better from our leaders.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial point, education. In the age of social media, It's more important than ever for people to be able to critically evaluate information
Right.
and distinguish fact from fiction.
That's where media literacy comes in.
Exactly.
We need to teach people how to spot fake news, how to identify bias, and how to think for themselves.
Absolutely. Because if we're not careful, we can easily be manipulated by those who are spreading disinformation for their own gain. And that's a threat to democracy everywhere.
So what you're saying is that protecting democracy is a shared responsibility. It's not just up to the government or the courts or the media.
Right.
It's up to all of us.
That's exactly right. Democracy is a fragile thing. It requires constant vigilance and active participation. And if we want to protect it, we need to be willing to fight for it every single day.
And let's go back to that disturbing thought about whether what allegedly happened in Brazil could be replicated elsewhere.
Yeah.
Are there any specific red flags that we should be looking out for? What are some of the early warning signs that democracy might be in danger?
That's a great question. And while every situation is unique, there are some common patterns that we can watch for. One of the most obvious is attacks on the press.
Okay.
When leaders start demonizing the media, calling them the enemy of the people, or accusing them of spreading fake news, that's a big red flag.
Because a free press is essential to holding those in power accountable.
Yeah.
If you silence the press, you silence dissent.
Exactly. Another red flag is attempts to undermine the independence of the judiciary.
Oh.
When leaders try to pack the courts with their own cronies or try to intimidate judges who rule against them, that's a serious cause for concern.
It's about eroding the checks and balances that are essential to a healthy democracy.
Another warning sign is the rise of extremist rhetoric and hate speech. When leaders start using inflammatory language that demonizes certain groups or incites violence, that's a dangerous trend.
Because it creates a climate of fear and division,
Yeah,
making it easier for those in power to exploit those divisions for their own gain.
exactly. And finally, we need to be wary of attempts to manipulate the electoral process itself.
Okay.
This could involve things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, or spreading disinformation about how to vote.
Because free and fair elections are the cornerstone of democracy. If people don't believe that their votes count, they're less likely to participate in the process, and that undermines the legitimacy of the entire system.
That's right. So these are just a few of the warning signs that we should be looking out for. And if we see these things happening, we need to speak out, we need to organize, and we need to fight back. Because the stakes are simply too high to remain silent.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's been a pretty intense journey.
It has.
This report has really shed light on some dark corners of the political landscape,
It has.
but it's also given us a lot to think about, a lot to be vigilant about, and a lot to fight for.
I agree. And I think the most important takeaway is that we all have a role to play in protecting democracy. It's not something that we can take for granted. It's something that we have to constantly work to preserve and strengthen.
So what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this deep dive? What's the message you want them to carry with them?
Stay engaged, stay informed, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. Democracy is fragile, but it's also resilient. And if we all do our part, we can protect it for generations to come.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave our listener with that thought. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and thanks for joining us on the deep dive.